Hey, this video is about StarCraft 2 history, and this one is about Polt, specifically Polt's America, and I'll be going over his entire, Heart of the Swarm career because I think it all fits into just one giant arc for Polt. And this is also going to go into his legacy as a player because I think the entire thing is kind of interconnected in a way where I couldn't break it apart like some of the other arcs of players where they've been and what they did. So to start off with Polt by the time he goes to the Heart of the Swarm is reformed in the eyes of the community. Like I said, early on in 2011 he was seen as a villain. He stopped MMA from winning the Super Tournament. He called out Jinro for not being good enough for Code S. But it all turns around in the Broodlord Infestor era, because in the Broodlord Infestor era, he plays against Stefano multiple times, incredible matchups. Basically, you see a version of Polt that makes you understand why he's a tactical genius, because Polt was a guy who could outmaneuver and outthink the Broodlord Infestor, and he really forced Stefano to go all out, and the two of them played incredible matches. I think it was like a 50-50 split, if I'm not mistaken, which just shows how incredible Polt was because it's incredibly imbalanced for Zerg at that time. And so when WCS comes around, all the Koreans start praising Polt as this genius, half jokingly, half seriously, because Polt, before WCS had been announced, had already said he was going to America. So everyone's like, oh my god, this genius, 200 IQ move, already getting all that easy money. And this was a great move for Polt's part because I think Polt was on the downside when it came to his mechanical play. This is something that nobody has ever said throughout Polt's career, but I'll say it now. Basically, from 2013 onwards, mechanically he wasn't in like the top. He wasn't even in like the top 30 or top 40 players in the world. Like I feel like almost all the Koreans and a lot of the better foreigners and even some of the average foreigners were mechanically much more sound than he was in terms of builds, refinement, execution, economy. So, having said all that, because this is an important part to state in terms of context, like I said, so many players were mechanically better skilled than Polt was. But Polt is one of the most successful players in WCS NA, and actually, when he does play in some of these lands against some of the best Koreans, he actually exhibits an incredible amount of skill to the point where some of the players have huge amounts of respect for Polt, specifically Deer in 2013 and Rain in 2014. And so what happens during this time is basically Polt has evolved yet again. So basically, to follow the path of Polt, 2011, he starts off as this Warcraft 3-esque player, as in he's doing this kind of two-base style timing attack, and tactically speaking, he does change the game, specifically for TVT in the Super Tournament against MMA in the finals, where he basically does this very aggressive Marine split against tanks and basically tells the world, you've been sieging your tanks wrong the entire time because they're all exposed, they're all in vulnerable positions, and I'm going to take advantage of that. He does, and he defeats MMA in that TVT to win the finals. Now, in 2012, you see kind of an evolution of Polt's thought where he goes to 3-base, 4-base, and he's setting up these gigantic battle plans, basically, where in his belief, he believed the only way to beat Broodlord Infestor was to come down from all sides. So this was a guy who specifically created scenarios where, especially on Entombed Valley, where he had like a 270-degree surround on the Zerg army, because at that point it's too hard to infest all of it, and he was probably the best at it, honestly. And look up the Polt versus DRG games from one of the MLGs, and you'll see what I mean. Basically, Polt has this incredible surround, and he keeps doing this over and over and over again. He even does it at IPL. He becomes like one of the few Terran players that's actually successful during the era of Broodlord Infestor. And that's why I've always given him a lot of credit, because this is a guy who could ignore metas. Unlike, say, Innovation, where Innovation basically always has to rely on the meta being good for Terran, because the way his style works, the way he thinks about the game, he doesn't have that special something that lets him break out of imbalance the way like this Polt guy does. And it's a very good counterpoint, because I think innovation is completely on the other end of the spectrum. Incredible mechanics throughout his entire career. Also very smart, but in a very specific way. Whereas like Polt can only rely on his intelligence and his tactics, and that's why he is such an interesting player to watch. Because if you want a player to prove that mechanics wasn't everything, this is the player to point out, because this guy was so incredibly successful despite, in my opinion, having some of the worst mechanics relative to the competitive field from 2013 onwards. Even in his regional, in his like regional tournament WCSNA, right? And so you go into 2013, and like I said, this like 2013 to 2015 onwards, just the Polt show in America. And usually I recommend like specific, if you've been following this, I recommend like specific games, specific series. But basically, it doesn't really matter what game or what series you're watching, because Polt is going to bring it every single game, every single series. And the reason he does that is because he comes to this strange realization at some point where he believes, and he's correct in believing this, that he is mechanically inferior to every opponent he is probably ever going to face on a competitive level. So every player is always going to have a lead on him in terms of supply, in terms of upgrades, in terms of money spent, in terms of efficiency. Every single player, almost every single player he meets from this point onwards, is going to have this lead up on him. But Polt is always going to make a comeback. Polt is always going to win. And how does he do this? He's actually one of the best comeback players, arguably the best, if you just want to talk about consistency rather than like ridiculous ceiling. Like if you're talking about ridiculous ceiling, obviously that goes to MVP, but Polt is definitely one of the best. The only other player I can think of that's quite as ridiculous as him is maybe Parting in PvZ. But basically, here's what Polt does. Is Polt realizes, if I cannot fight a direct battle, I won't fight a direct battle. I will stall them out. I will find different way. I will find situations to create different damages. Basically, what Polt does is he creates Rat Dota in StarCraft 2. Or maybe a real world example might be like the Fabian strategy, or like that idea of like Sun Tzu, like strike when they're weak, basically something like that. And so his entire strategy is always about the base trade. It's always about taking advantage. It's always about positioning. It's always about finding ways to make the game no longer about their game plan. It's about your game plan, and your game plan is to counterattack. Because in a counterattack, it doesn't matter if they have better micro, because your armies aren't fighting each other. Pretty simple, right? So that's basically what Polt does for the entirety of the rest of his career. It's actually incredible to watch. It's incredibly underrated. Like basically no other Terran can do this kind of style. So if you're just talking about like the epitome of his style, Polt is the epitome of his style. And like I said, it's always one of the reasons why I've always respected him so much in terms of play. And you go through the rest of his career, doesn't matter when. Basically from 2013 to like middle 2015, this guy is basically beasting it up. In America, like WCSNA, he beats Season 2, he beats Oz, he beats Tasia, he beats Jaedong. I think I went over that. Oz was okay. I don't think he was ever that great. He was just specifically good in PvP for whatever reason again. Polt in WCSNA Season 3, he has some better results. Basically beats let's see here, Buell, Apocalypse, Heart, Oz again, Buell in the finals. MLG Spring, the one he wins in 2013, is the one where he beats Naniwa, Deer, Naniwa, Hyun. Like, that's actually pretty legit. It's actually one of the reasons why Deer, when he goes into the Wild Road and goes into BlizzCon that year of 2013, like, he's asked in a pre-tournament interview if there was any player he was afraid of, and he actually points out, among all the different players there, Innovation, Maru, Tasia, Jaedong, whoever you want, he points out Polt as the player he believes will be his biggest problem, because Polt, even though weaker mechanically speaking, was much smarter than much smarter than a bunch of the different players there, and stylistically speaking, he had like Deer's number. in a sense, or maybe that's what Deer thought, because Polt was thinking, like I said, on a different level. It's also why like WCS the system is kind of sad, just because you don't really get to see a lot of the great matchups that could have been. So, for instance, I already pointed out Flash versus Jaedong. I feel like 2013 was the perfect year for them to have that rivalry, because both of them were very good that year, but neither of them got to play against each other at all. Actually, throughout the entirety of StarCraft 2, so that was a waste of time. And as for Polt specifically, I always felt like Polt was such a complicated player for the Protoss players to play against, that he always had a chance against any top Korean Protoss, and they all respected him. Like, you go down to next year 2015, I believe, in BlizzCon, and Reigns like, yeah, Polt was a fucking real threat, even though like Polt was basically at the end of his career, and Polt almost beats him. And then of course you have the Blink era, which I'll get into now, I suppose. So basically, the Blink era is like this 3-month span, arguably longer, depends on how you define it, but a 3-month span at the beginning of 2014 where Protoss is dominating everything, because not only do the next like crop of great Protoss players come up, so CJ Hero, not sure if Stats was there, but Zest was definitely there, Classic, Rain, Parting, like all the like great Protoss players of Heart of the Swarm basically are all popping up, specifically from Kespa, and they're all kicking the shit out of everybody. And basically what happens during this time is, to put context, everybody knows how great Innovation is. Innovation dropped like a bomb, basically. He was basically non-relevant because, like I said earlier, his ability to play in imbalanced metas is very suspect, and so he didn't do much of anything. TY had one good match, and everybody thought that meant he could play the matchup. No, he couldn't. Actually, he basically just did a huge gamble, got it paid off, and won that match. And then when somebody didn't let him do that gamble, he instantly folded. So basically, there are only 3 turn players in this era, the Blink era I'm talking about, that could stand a chance. Maru, because he had by far the best micro and could basically out-execute any Protoss player despite them having the superior vision and the incredible execution of the Blink Stalkers. Tasia, because if you got to the late game, he basically outplayed any Protoss player. And Polt. And Polt's the one who uses his brain the most. Basically, he realizes, oh, that's cute. Basically, what's going to happen is you attack, but I'll also attack at the same time. And then I'll throw the game to chaos. I'll win from there. And that's basically what Polt does. And if you want to see, if there's a single tournament I could recommend, it's probably going to be Cologne 2014. Just look at Polt's run, specifically his run in the playoffs against Classic, against Rain, because these are 2 of the best Protoss players of all time, and specifically against PvT in the Blink era, and Polt outdoes both of them, wins 3-2, wins 3-2. An incredible like run, even in the finals when he plays against Hero, who, like, I went over that series with Ollie, but basically Ollie and Gemini, it's a very good series as well. Basically watch those 3 series and you'll understand why Polt was a fucking monster in terms of his brain, not in terms of his mechanics, not in terms of execution, in terms of his brain. This guy was a thinking man StarCraft 2 player, an incredible player, and somebody who really thought about the game in ways nobody else really thought of. Like, there's this great quote from one of his streams where basically somebody asked him on like the Twitch chat, why do you specifically try to use all these different builds? What are you trying to do with your ladder practice? And he basically says, listen, if I wanted to, I could win 9 out of 10 of these games, no problem. But I'm learning nothing from those 9 out of 10 games I win. But from these 10 out of 10 games I'm losing, or whatever it was, I'm learning way more than I could have the other way. So basically, Polt was a player who didn't think about wins as much as he thought about improvement in his method. And that's such a rare quality to have in a competitive player, because a competitive player, like, yeah, they want to become better, but they also want to win. And so it becomes like this very hard sort of mental struggle with players who like play on the ladder or play in scrims. Like, this is very endemic and very common in like NACS or Overwatch earlier on in its in its history, where basically you weren't getting very good practice in scrims because the NA players were basically just trying to win them as hard as they could rather than trying to learn. And that's something that Polt was always about. Polt was always about the learning, always about improving himself, because he understood that the biggest differential between him and his opponent was his mind. It wasn't his mechanics. It wasn't his execution. It wasn't his build. It was his mind and his tactics. And that was what makes Polt such an incredible player to follow, even though he doesn't get to play some of the best players in the world, which, like I said, it's too bad. But at the times you do get to see him, it's incredible to watch. Following that, he has IEM World Championship, another great event for him. Basically, ignore the Naniwa thing. That doesn't really matter. But against Deer, he does beat Deer. Like I said, Deer was a player who massively respected Polt. And then he plays against CJ Hero, almost beat CJ Hero. It's another typical Polt thing, but CJ Hero has incredible execution. So it's a bit too much of a ceiling to beat that time around. Because I think if you look at the guys he's basically beaten, Deer, Rain, Classic, they all have good execution, but none of them are on the level of CJ Hero and CJ Hero himself was, in terms of that era, probably the top two Protoss, just because of the Blink Stalkers. If you're just talking about execution, that is. Just because of the Blink Stalkers, the only guy I think is better than him is Parting. And as for, this is a funny thing, but basically SOS Jack's Heroes money again, that's always funny. That's always funny to me, anyway. So, going onwards to 2014, he gets to WCS Season 2, gets to the semifinals, beats Liquid Hero, and then loses to Bomber in the semifinals. Another very close series, and it goes exactly like I said. Basically, Bomber, even though he's on the downside, mechanically speaking, he's still better than Polt. But Polt himself is a very, very strong tactical mastermind. The difference is Bomber compared to some of the Terrans in Korea was a player who understood Bomber's style and could kind of play with it and against it. So he basically outdoes Polt here, and Bomber goes on to win that tournament. Another tournament was MLG Atlanta. Was it MLG Atlanta? That doesn't make sense. Let's check here. Oh, MLG Anaheim. That makes a lot more sense. What? MLG Atlanta. Okay. So basically, Polt dominates his group. Let's see here. This group included Ragnarok. You guys don't know him. Pretty decent Zerg player in WCSNA. Trap. Pretty strong Protoss player overall. Scarlet. Everybody knows Scarlet. Hyun. On the downslide, still a decent threat. Patreus was... I guess I'll do a little segment about Patreus right now. Basically, Patreus was a Zerg who was on the same level as hyped as Serral at the time, as basically this up-and-coming foreigner Zerg that could bring it to the top players. The difference is that basically Patreus gets his shit broken. What I mean by shit is his brain broken by this weird game by Stefano, and he was never the same player again. I'll go ahead and say I think Stefano probably killed his career, or maybe Patreus was never as good as the hype deemed him to be. Either way, he doesn't figure into the grand scheme of things in StarCraft 2 history, but an interesting sort of player to follow if you were from the C scene, because he did have points where people thought he could become something more. And then Polt goes on, he wins against Stardust, wins against Violet, and then loses the finals against Trap. Trap was a smart player and a cheesy sort of player, so Polt's typical style against him was basically a bad matchup, because basically Polt's initiative or counter initiative was getting stuffed by Trap just killing him a bunch of times. So it was always going to be a tough thing for Polt to win, but still a good tournament overall for Polt. Not as crazy as his clone. Obviously, I think his clone is fucking amazing, all things considered. You go to Red Bull Battlegrounds, and he does pretty good here. He loses to Kier, and Kier was, for 2 months, one of the best Terrans in the world. Kier loses to Bomber in the finals, but basically Kier is a game away from eliminating Innovation in a GSL semifinals. Basically, he goes 3-4. And if he could have won that easily, but basically that was Kier's peak. and so Polt plays against Kira. Kira wins, but Polt comes out of the group at Red Bull Battlegrounds, Washington, by beating Parting and Scarlet, and this is very good for Polt because, like I said, Parting is an incredible player still, and Scarlet was, I think, this is her peak as a player, her peak skill basically. So Polt beating Scarlet, no joke either. Polt loses to Bomber, very close matchup again, but not as good. And then you go into like BlizzCon. I think that particular BlizzCon he runs straight into Rain very early on, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, that's classic. Oh, this one's ridiculous actually. I may as well talk about it. So basically, Polt finishes in the top. Basically, gets eliminated early on in the single limb against Classic. But the reason this one is ridiculous is because basically Polt pulls out this ridiculous mech build in game. Let's see here, game 4 on Overgrowth, and is basically, as far as I know, a altered Gumiho build that Gumiho once used in Pro League. Basically, completely catches Classic off guard, wins the game, and is like, wow, fucking Polt, so fucking smart. But basically, Classic's too good. He wins out overall in the end. And by the end of 2014, it's kind of clear that Polt's shenanigans or Polt's style is phasing out. And it's not because of the style itself being wrong. I think it's actually because Polt himself, his mechanics were even deteriorating even worse as time went on. So, like, basically the early game lead the other players are getting on him was becoming more and more massive. So his late game style, his counterattack style, had to do even more work as time went on. So it's kind of ridiculous in retrospect how far he got, all things considered. And then WCS Season 1, he beats Hydra, another ridiculous sort of I come from behind victory again. And then WCS Season 2, he loses to Hydra because Hydra is probably the better player anyway, but just goes to show how good Polt was because he could win these matchups where he was not favored to win. And as for the BlizzCon finals, this is the one where he plays against Rain, and like he almost eliminates Rain, and Rain basically comes out as like saying, "Wow, Polt was fucking ridiculous." So that about covers it. So basically, that's Polt's America, Polt's 2013-2015, and my overall thoughts about Polt as a player, Polt as a person, Polt as a Terran, I suppose. And what I'd like to point out, I think, is that Polt was one of the most tactically sound minds in StarCraft 2 history, and somebody who basically proves that it's possible to win with much lesser mechanics and with just your mind and tactics. And he was, in my opinion, one of the top players of all time in StarCraft 2. I think I put him as like 5th, I believe, or maybe 6th, very close to MMA. But basically, this is a player who used his mind rather than his mechanics to outwit and outdo some of the best players of all time, some of them in very imbalanced metas, and makes a very strong history for himself, even without playing in Korea in the latter years. So there you go. That's Polt in a nutshell. See you guys later.